All right. Well, I am going to kick off this presentation. I think I have about 20 minutes, so I have a lot to get through. Just by way of some background, I do know some of you in the room. It would have been really nice to touch base. I see some familiar faces kind of in the background there. A lot of you I didn't know, but perhaps our paths will cross someday. I've worked with Canada Beef for about 12 years now, most of that full-time on staff, some of that as a consultant. And over this time, I've learned a lot about beef personally as a dietitian, but also about what others know or don't know about beef. And that's both consumers and health professionals. There's a lot of beef is more complex than you would think. And there's a lot of misinformation about beef, which probably is no surprise to this group. So for this presentation, what I thought I would do is touch on some of the most misunderstood points about beef, but also use it as an opportunity to give you a tour of your ground beef toolkit, which I believe you have received or will receive as part of this day. It really is the be-all, end-all of everything ground beef. You would think there wasn't much to say about ground beef that could fit a whole binder, but surprisingly there is, and I'm going to use this presentation kind of to guide you through some of the rich information that's in that binder. So let me just start by saying one of the things that I have learned that stands out working at Canada Beef is that actually Canadians love beef, and most Canadians still consume beef. In fact, the latest research from Dalhousie University, which was published last year, found that 92% of Canadians consume beef at least once a week. And that does corroborate with research that we have at Canada Beef internally. But, you know, despite what we sometimes hear in the media, this and that, we know that Canadians love and do eat beef. So it's an important food as food and health professionals to really understand. So as the first kind of opportunity to introduce you to the toolkit, this is on page 1.5. We've got lots of statistics about, in this case, ground beef. So you'll see, for example, that ground beef is about 50% of the beef that is purchased at retail. We know Canadians love ground beef, and it is the most popular grind, making up 83% of the purchases. And we know that the majority of ground beef purchased is lean or extra lean. So, though, let me tackle a bit of the elephant in the room. While we do know Canadians love beef, you know, we know they have a lot of questions and are sometimes conflicted. So this cartoon, while it's funny and it's a little extreme, I'm sure it's not that unfamiliar to most of us in this day and age. So for lunch, this gentleman had root beer, potato chips, and 2 candy bars, and that's because he gave up red meat, and it's so much easier than he thought. That one was kind of you know, a cartoon, but this one seems to be a real lady, just something I came across on the internet. And again, I'm sure it's not altogether unfamiliar. This lady proudly tells us that she's a pescatarian, so she doesn't eat red meat. But after dinner, she's happy to eat some cookies. So we are at an interesting crossroads with regards to health and nutrition, and a lot of confusion and questions out there, some of which I will address today. So let's start with just the nutrition basics about beef. There's no denying that beef is inherently very nutrient rich. This is the percent daily values of its micronutrient content per 100 grams of cooked beef. As you can see, just very nutrient rich. There are 7 minerals that it qualifies as a source of. There are 7 vitamins that it qualifies as a source of. There aren't too many foods that really can reach these highs in micronutrients. And all this for, of course, being an excellent source of protein, that goes without saying, naturally low in sodium. And it's single ingredient, you know, nothing added, and it's not fortified. And that in and of itself is sometimes a myth that consumers have, that people think, particularly with regards to ground beef, that there has been something added, but there isn't. not color, not preservatives, nothing else. Those are some of the things that consumers tell us they think are in ground beef. This is on cuts. The nutrient content of ground beef would be very similar, and it's in your toolkit. So as part of this presentation, what I thought I would do, and I was intending to be there in person, so I was going to do this as a live quiz, but I'm going to put forward some of the questions that Canadians have told us. Again, consumers and health professionals, they don't know about beef. So I've turned this into a bit of a quiz, and I can't really do it in an interactive way with you guys, but I'll let you guys think about the answers in your minds, and then I'll tell you what the answers are. So this stat should come as no surprise, I'm sure, to most people here, but Canadians are consuming far too many highly processed foods, or what we call ultra processed foods. The latest statistic from Health Canada actually says it's 46.5% of our calories, and that's higher for certain demographics like teenage boys, that kind of thing. So we are consuming, in other words, almost half of our calories from highly processed foods, a failing grade for Canadian diets for sure. But my question for you is, and maybe a less known fact, is what percent of our calories do you think are coming from unprocessed red meat? Okay, so give that a thought for a second. I'll give you three options. Would it be 5% of our calories are coming from unprocessed red meat? Would it be 15%? Or do you think that 25% of our calories are coming from unprocessed red meat? And remember that 50% almost are from highly processed food. I'll give you a second to think about that. And I'll let you know that the answer is actually 5%. And this, again, this statistic is in your toolkit on page 1.7. You'll see quite a few statistics here. This comes as a surprise to most people. I think there's sort of an underlying belief that Canadians consume excessive amounts of red meat. The reality is that we really are consuming a moderate amount of red meat. We consume on average about 288 grams per week. That translates to less than 3 meals in a week on average. And yeah, that's what I want to say about that. Lots of stats on that page in 1.7. So much less than we assumed. And if people think it's going up, that's actually the opposite of the truth. The case is that beef in general has been going down. This is an analysis that has been done by Statistics Canada. It was a 30-year trend analysis that looked at the main commodities that Canadians are consuming over this time period. And you'll see a very interesting trend. Clearly on the far left, we've got beef, which has declined the most of all the commodities. You'll see some other commodities like fluid milk and eggs have also gone down. But what's really, really interesting and concerning about this particular chart is that is the 7 commodities that have gone up. Is that 7? Yes, that's 7 commodities that have gone up. If you notice, those are the commodities that make up a specific kind of food. And I'll let you think about that for a second. We've got like rice and wheat flour and salad oils and chicken and cheese. And I'll just tell you right now, those represent the foods that you'll find in more highly processed foods, specifically fast foods and, coffee shop, muffins and that kind of thing. So this represents more like a pattern of eating changing to, frozen pizzas and takeout, that kind of thing. So it really is a pattern that we're seeing in a number of statistics. And by the way, during this 30-year trend analysis, incidentally, obesity increased, tripled. So just to sort of summarize that, there's really a reality check here. Ultra-processed foods or highly processed foods now dominate the food supply chain in all industrialized countries, and Canada is definitely no exception to that. Okay, so I did not put the right forward here, but need to fix that slide. But I'm going to move on to my second question. This is about the terms that you see when you go into the grocery store on ground beef products. So, for example, you're familiar with the terms extra lean, etc. So extra lean means that ground beef contains a maximum of 10% fat. In case you didn't know the number, that's not necessarily something people can roll off their tongues. And lean contains a maximum of 17% fat. Okay, so we're all familiar with that. So my question to you is, are these terms the same for other ground meats, like ground chicken, ground pork, or are they different? So my first answer is that no, they're all different. These just apply to ground beef. Second answer is yes, the terms are the same for all ground meat products. Or three, you don't know. So just give you a chance to think about that for a second. Okay, so the answer is that they apply to all grinds, no matter what the meat. So again, on page 1.2, we've got quite a good description of what the terms mean, and to explain that these are terms regulated by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And as I just said, they do apply to any and all ground meat, and that's beef, chicken, veal, pork, lamb, whatever. And what this means is that the maximum fat in a product that's labeled with the same designation has the same maximum fat. So, for example, lean chicken and lean ground beef have the same maximum fat amount, and that would be 17%. Extra lean turkey and extra lean ground beef would have the same maximum fat content. Now, just to kind of add one little point to this, one of the things that has become very clear, especially in the last year or so with front of pack discussions and front of pack labeling, which incidentally just were published about 5 minutes ago while I was waiting for this call. Health Canada has now published the new FOP guidelines. Gazette 2 just came out. But we have realized very clearly that people are very, very confused by how to read a nutrition facts table because there are percentages that kind of almost seem like they're conflicting. So on page 1.4, we have put together a little information key on how to understand the various percentages with regards to beef as they relate to the lean and extra lean descriptors. What's confusing here is that extra lean has a maximum fat content of 10%, but when you look at the fat, it says 11%. However, that's because those are based on two very different calculations. We've walked you through how to understand those calculations. This product, based on its fat grams, actually has a fat content of 8%, which is why it's allowed to be labeled extra lean, but it's the percent DV of fat that's 11%. So this is very confusing to consumers. So hopefully this can be helpful in your conversations and education. Okay, next question. I've got a couple more. This is probably one of the most one of the conversations we most often have is around the fat in beef. I think when people think about, the negatives about beef, it usually is around the fat. So let's talk about fat for a few minutes here. So what would you think is the answer to this question? Is the fat in beef, is it saturated? Is all saturated? Do you think it would be roughly about 50% saturated, 50% unsaturated, so about half and half? Or would you think it's about 90% saturated and 10% unsaturated? You probably never thought so much about the fat in beef as I'm asking you to think about right now, but give that some thought for a moment and I will give you the answer. Okay, so this is again in your toolkit on page 3.7. This really is a surprise to most people, health professionals included. I talk to dietitians all the time, student dietitians. It's a really not well-known fact. But the answer to the question is roughly 50-50. So I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but there is in fact, there's more unsaturated fat in beef than there is saturated. And the type of unsaturated fat, which is predominantly MUFAs or monounsaturated, it's actually oleic acid. That word might sound familiar to you. It's the same kind of healthy fat that's found in olive oil and avocados, that healthy fat where we tell people to consume. So I could have asked you a question about what avocados, olive oil, and ground beef have in common, and that would be the answer. And people don't necessarily realize, but meats in general are quite a significant source of MUFAs in our diets overall. It's not just saturated fat that you find in beef. And Extrapolating from that comment, where is the saturated fat coming from in our diets? That's an important question, particularly with front of pack and all the discussions about, foods that are going to be labeled high in saturated fat coming down the line very shortly. So let's look at the stats. Where do you think saturated fat is coming from our diets? When we talk saturated fat, I know that it tends to be, the default advice to cut your red meat intake, but is that really kind of where saturated fat is coming from? So I'm giving you a few categories here. Do you think most of the saturated fat is coming from butter and oils in our diet, red and processed meats, dairy products, or do you think it's from somewhere else other? I'll let you think about that. Okay, so guess what? We have this answer in the toolkit. Page 3.7, you can find an analysis of the sources of saturated fat in the Canadian diet and quite a bit more about saturated fat because it is really seems to be our villain nutrient. The majority of the saturated fat in the diet of Canadians comes from this category down here called all other foods. And what that is that's foods outside the food guide. So that's making up almost half of our calories. Coupled with the fact that so many of our calories are coming from highly processed food, I kind of always say we really have a fire burning in our house. And that's this issue of the poor quality of our diets being made up of highly processed foods and all the negative nutrients that they are really contributing. So in terms of the foods that are on the food guide, which is the rest of this pie, you can see the milk and alternatives about a quarter, meat and alternatives about a quarter, but of that, fresh red meat is only 9%. Vegetables and fruit and whole grains make up the difference with, a little bit there. So what this is saying is that 91% of the saturated fat in our diets is actually not from red meat. And I, as a dietitian, sort of always challenge people maybe to have a singular focus about all of these ultra processed foods we're eating, because, without these foods in this pie, we wouldn't really even have a saturated fat problem in Canada, which is a whole possibly debatable and a subject for another conversation. I also want to point out that saturated fat is a natural part of many, many whole foods. We put together this little chart. It's the percent daily value of a number of foods. This I'm not sure you have this chart in your ground beef toolkit. We did develop it very recently, and I think we wanted to send it with your toolkit, but it is now posted on the online version, which is easy to find on our Think Beef website. So it's a very interesting chart because what we did is we just took a whole number of just wholesome, nutritious foods, including like salmon, and there's strip loin steak here, and of course all the ground beef. We've got dairy products, we've got cheese, and based on their reference amounts, this is the percent DV of saturated fat that they contain. So you can see that many good for you foods contain saturated fat, and it's just a natural part of the fatty acid mix, which people don't always realize that most foods that have fat, it's really a mix of the three types. Okay, I can't go too fast with my slides here. Okay, so I think this is my last question, and the question is to fill in the blank here. When you consume beef in the presence of plant-based iron sources, so like vegetables, grains, pulses, do you think the beef has an impact on the absorption of the iron in those foods? So the question is, would consuming beef with those foods inhibit the absorption of iron from those plant-based foods? Would it enhance, or would it have no impact? So in other words, is there any kind of synergy that's going on, positive or negative? So the answer here in your toolkit, you will find this sort of infographic here on the left in the appendix. And in here, we talk about something called food synergy. And specifically in this case, and there's lots of examples of food synergy in the overall food matrix, but there is a specific one with regards to iron, and that's called the meat factor. It's the term that's kind of loosely used, not really an official term, but it is well documented that when you consume animal-based foods, not just beef, but any animal-based protein with plant-based sources of iron, you're actually enhancing the iron absorption of the iron portion in the plant-based food. So you may know that in animal foods, the type of iron is different than the type of iron you find in plant-based foods. Heme iron is in animal foods, non-heme iron in plant foods. And heme iron just tends to be better absorbed. It is better absorbed. But when you actually add meat or a source of vitamin C to a plant-based protein that has iron, you will increase the non-heme absorption. So this is a good thing, and why the balanced plate that has, lots of plant proteins with some meat is just such a great model to eat by. And I kind of call beef, the iron in beef, beef's VIN, or very important nutrient. And I think, before I worked for beef, I have to say, even as like a dietitian in all my roles before, a young dietitian, I never quite understood the importance of iron in our diets. I think it's quite a misunderstood nutrient. According to the World Health Organization, it is the nutrient deficiency. This is the only nutrient that remains deficient in industrialized countries. And that's saying something. And it's actually no exception in Canada. We don't have necessarily iron nailed down in this country, despite, our wealth. It's estimated that about a third of women of childbearing age are under consuming iron. Some recent research in the last year, there's been 2 important studies that are showing very concerning rates of iron deficiency during pregnancy, possibly up and more than 50% of pregnancies may be affected. And it's important to know that iron is a really critical nutrient to growth and development, and deficiency during childhood can have serious and irreversible effects on brain development. So lots to say about iron. And of course, it is beef's fin. This stat about the 30% of women comes from a study that was published just last year, I believe, by Mary Labe's lab at U of T. We have a full description of that study. It didn't just look at iron, it actually looked at nutrients in general. It's on page 3.3. There's some this is an amazing study, actually. It found that a significant number of Canadians actually have nutrient shortfalls in quite a significant number of nutrients. You can see the full list here. They don't just pertain to beef. This wasn't at all a beef study, but it is notable to point out that many of the vitamins that are inadequate are vitamins that you do find in beef. And just a little bit of beef can go a long way to addressing the nutrients of concern among many Canadians, and particularly those vulnerable populations like pregnant women, children, infants, seniors who, we're seeing a wave of sarcopenia, and that's getting worse. So just sort of in conclusion, I think it's I think everybody in this room would agree with this. It's clear, there's almost no Canadian eating enough vegetables, fiber, potassium. We really need to be increasing that. We love the plate model for that reason, half your plate being vegetables, whole grains. We need to be reducing our refined grains. I think in my presentation, I've given you enough statistics to justify that. And, from beef's perspective, the question becomes, well, what should come off the plate? Is it red meat? And we really believe it's increasing your vegetable consumption by decreasing your refined grains and not decreasing other nutrient-rich foods like beef. And I sign off with this wonderful little quote that I find words to live by. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Karine.